Good evening. I'm very honored tonight to welcome you in the name of Barclays to this event, which is the last of a series of conferences which have taken place in the last weeks and days. And we are very pleased to sponsor this event. First, I would like to thank a few people who have made this event possible, particularly Michael Amian, the founder of Zamin, and Sir Mark Moody-Stuart, the chairman of Zamin. Obviously, the Tate Modern for hosting these lectures, and particularly Sir Nicholas Sirota, as well as the Tate director, Marco Daniel, convener of adult programs. The program's other partners, Accenture, Africa Progress Panel, and SOAS. Tonight's event is one of the series being held on a broad theme of global citizenship and governance, focusing specifically on issues facing Africa, a significant region for Barclays, because you might know that Barclays is probably the biggest bank in Africa. Barclays is particularly supportive of such dialogue, which brings together thought leaders from different disciplines to discuss global issues affecting business and society. This evening, we will be debating possible lessons for the G8 governments. Well, I'm particularly careful in using the word or giving other people lessons, but the theme and the discussion will focus on the role of these governments in fostering cooperation between governance, business, and other parts of our society. Let me say maybe two words only, pro domo, that Barclays has, under new leadership and new management, fully engaged in what we do call as well global citizenship. We do look for cooperation and interaction with not only governments, but with any parts of our social fabric. We try and will certainly commit to look at any part of our business, at our actions, at our activities, with a sense of determining whether these activities stand up, are being conducted in the way prudent, cautious bankers should conduct their business, but particularly as well whether these activities, engagements, commitments, lending activities, and so forth serve economic progress and serve to make the world a better place. Personally, I spent the last 10 years mostly in what is generally called emerging markets, which is not necessarily an appropriate expression, but spanning from Argentina to Russia and other areas. And it is in these areas as well where the bank will have to look at every single angle of our business, and it is a good and important subject to bring up. We are faced with enormous complexities. We are faced with constant decision-making, whether we should continue our activities in certain countries or should start activities in certain countries, whether we should commit lending our capital to these countries, whether we should accept that these countries are different, whether we should accept sometimes oppressive regimes and nevertheless continue to engage. All of these are very difficult questions. It is each time a judgment whether one should appear as a sponsor of a government with whose policies we disagree. It is a question of judgment whether we should support companies who are run by individuals who exploit their own population, whether we should engage or retreat. And I belong, after these 10 years of activities, where I firmly believe that we did achieve a lot of progress with all the inefficiencies which still exist, where we are channeling capital in capital-hungry countries, that the presence of ourselves and many others is more important than given or looking for lectures and for boycotts. We do know that finance plays an important role. We do know that many of these countries will depend on foreign financing for decades to come, that there will be no progress without the necessary capital supporting these activities. We are obliged to ask for certain rules to be applied, for certain things to be done, for certain behavior patterns, because we are responsible at the same time to our investor clients, to people who engage with us in these areas. It's a tricky question. It's complex. It's like an engine with 10,000s of little wheels which have to turn in the right direction to drive the big wheels. But we do think that in probing, in judging, in making consistently new surveys and how to behave and what to do, in the end, we are making progress. We don't want to teach other countries. We don't want to impose on them our rules and our laws. We want to adjust. We want to understand. Without commitment, and that's what the chairman is doing, without dialogue, without meeting, without understanding, and without the necessary respect towards these countries who find themselves in a different phase of development, progress is not possible. With that, I would like to introduce tonight your panel, and which will speakers and panel who will give us their ideas, what they think, how an organization like this and how the world can develop and make progress, and how interaction and exchange of ideas can help us all. And next to me, Sir Mark Moody-Stuart. He's the keynote speaker for tonight. He is Samin's chair and the chairman of the Foundation for the Global Compact. He was also former chairman of Anglo-American and the Shell Group. And there couldn't be more international companies, which I'm sure have given you a set of experiences and insight from which we will all benefit. Mr. Paul Collier is professor of economics and public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government and director of the Center for African Economies at the University of Oxford. He will be a little bit late because he's still on his train, but he will join us in the course of this evening. We have as well Mr. Jamie Drummond, is the executive director and co-founder of ONE, a global advocacy organization which at the moment is providing a very active crowd with excellent music at the outside of this building. It calls on governments to keep their promise to support the citizens of the world's poorest countries. Indeed, that is an extraordinary important job. And I saw the slogan where it says, already at a very young age, I learned that without screaming and asking, I wouldn't get anything. So if that is the slogan, it's on the good way tonight, because the music, I can assure you, is excellent. We have with us as well Strive Masiyiwa, the founder and executive chairman of global telecommunication group Econet Wireless, And he has been involved in numerous initiatives to promote entrepreneurship and social development in Africa. And finally, tonight's chairperson, all well known to you, Mary Robinson, who is the president of the Mary Robinson Foundation and served as president of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002. Thank you very much, and if I may turn it over to you as the chairperson of tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm intrigued and pleased to be here because we're talking about global citizenship and the G8 meeting. I'm thrilled that the G8 meeting is happening in Northern Ireland. Let me just put that on the table first because I think it's an interesting place, and the fact that so many people will come to that part of the world, I think, is a good thing in itself, although it may be a contested one, but it's still a good thing, I think. I didn't realise that I was wearing the right colour this evening. This is a very red room, and I don't know if there's any significance in that, but it's lovely to be in the Tate Modern Gallery. I'm a great fan of the Tate. I'm also aware that there have been a lot of meetings in London. I was here over the weekend for the meeting on nutrition, which actually ended up in some good commitments on nutrition and linked nutrition to issues of health and water, and I'm glad to say, because it's my passion, climate change. So I think we can have quite a conversation. As I look at the audience, it's actually quite a young audience looking around. Not everybody's young, but to me, almost everybody's younger than me these days. So I hope we can have a good, diverse discussion when the time comes, and I'm very pleased that the panel itself is quite diverse and that we can have a good conversation. There are sort of ways of being provocative about the G8, and I think one of the things that I'd like to provoke in our later discussion is how do we accommodate the right to development in the context of our world today, the right to development of those coming into middle class now who want the same lifestyle and consumer gadgets that we have enjoyed and that have been the product of the fossil fuel growth that is warming our world. How do we have a different perception of a middle class that can have a good standard of living but doesn't have to be as consumer driven? These are one of the kinds of issues that we need to discuss. We've heard the issues of how we address the balance of power that is changing in our world. And I have great pleasure in reintroducing, because he was introduced to you briefly, Mark Moody-Stuart, who will give a lead talk, and I have no doubt thoughtful speech. I've known Mark for quite a long time. His current position is he's Zeman's chair, and he's also chair of the foundation of the Global Compact. And I worked with him on the board of the Global Compact for a number of years with a healthy tension between us, because I chaired the human rights group of the Global Compact, and I kept pushing, and he kept explaining, and I kept pushing, and he kept explaining. But it's a good relationship. And prior to that, he was chair of the Anglo-American from 2002 to 2009, and chair of the Shell Group from 1998 to 2001. But I've always found that Mark is somebody who thinks things through, and even though I don't always agree with him, I value the opportunity to listen to him. So Mark, you have the podium, actually. You're the only one who's going to be allowed up there until I can call on Ben Oakrey later. So use your privilege. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mary. Your successor as chair of the Human Rights Working Group of the Global Compact is Pierre Sané, who formerly of Amnesty International. And you might be disappointed to know that he asked me, because he said he needed business in there, to co-chair it. So I've kind of got it. I've got inside the tent now. Like Hans-Joerg, I'm a bit cautious about giving advice to the G8, and in particular, the last time I tried to give advice to the G8 was in 2001, and with my co-chair of the G8 Task Force on Renewable Energy, Corrado Clini, we were going to make a presentation to the G8 meeting in Genoa, and at the last moment we were disinvited at the request of the Bush administration. It was said that George W. would not attend if we made the presentation. That probably did something for my street cred, but I'm not sure if it did much for his education. Caution is needed, and perhaps we lacked diplomacy. There are other reasons. First of all, the G8 gets a lot of advice, much of it conflicting. And second, as Ian Bremmer has pointed out in his talk on the G8 last night, that the G8 is a bit of an anachronism. Martin Wolf actually described it in this room yesterday as a zombie, and he's quite clearly not a diplomat. The G20 is much more appropriate, I think, and representative. Its members generate something like 80% of global GDP, and its north-south, east-west balance is a great deal better. The G20 also differs from the G8 that it's always involved business, and even does so formally now with something called the B20. I regard this as a positive step, but some would regard it as unacceptable access, and Mary would probably be included in that. So I had originally planned to draw on all the talks for recommendations, but the range is just too wide. In both the artifacts and universities debate, the impacts of business and markets were clearly important and discussed. On Monday, Paul Pullman, the boss of Unilever, a member of the B20, painted a very vivid picture, I think, of the role of responsible business. And he describes the approach as being not merely one that's desirable, but one that's actually essential for the survival of business and if they're to thrive. Businesses are not philanthropic organizations, but that doesn't mean, Paul Pullman said, that they should not serve society. The Economist expressed in a cover story a few years ago the concern that with corporate responsibility and so on, companies might misguidedly take on the responsibilities of government and indeed vice versa. They defined the responsibilities of governments in setting frameworks and priorities, providing for regulation, regulatory frameworks, providing public goods, regulating, collecting taxes to pay for them. And I think we'd all say amen to that. But what about the large areas of the world where governments are either incapable or unwilling of doing those sort of things, or worse still, steal the means by which they're supposed to do it, or oppress and abuse their own people? And if we want the sort of functioning society which we can do business, business needs to work with others to create the capacities and conditions in which we can work. Now, you may feel that the concept of business and civil society working to address issues in society which impact on sustainability and governance is a pipe dream, cloud cuckoo land. In fact, I believe it's the one area in the last 20 years where we've seen serious progress through joint action by business and civil society. It started in trade and with consumers. For example, WWF and Unilever working on sustainable fisheries, the Forest Stewardship Council, and now there are numerous examples. Similarly, the Kimberley process was set up to deal with conflict diamonds, and 99% of diamonds now go through the Kimberley process, and it helps prevent the fueling of conflict. The voluntary principles of security and human rights were developed by governments, human rights organizations, and responsible businesses to develop rules for use in cases where armed security is needed. And there are two big advantages of business and civil society, and indeed organized labor, working together in this way. First of all, they keep each other honest. And second, a combination of business and civil society is more likely to be trusted than either in isolation, although, of course, civil society is much more trusted than businesses. And a coalition can demonstrate to governments practical things which could be achieved. But if they're to work together, they need to build trust, and trust depends on the business side, on businesses reporting very openly on their performance, not just financially, but the impact of their business on society and the environment. And this can be done using standardized indicators like the Global Reporting Initiative, or now developing the Integrated Reporting Council initiatives. The largest of such multi-stakeholder organizations and groupings is actually the United Nations Global Compact, initiated by Kofi Annan in 2000 and enthusiastically supported by his successor as Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. They now consist of over 7,500 companies in 145 different countries around the world, employing about 50 million people. And they have each individually, publicly committed themselves to embedding the major UN principles on human rights, environment, working conditions, and anti-corruption into their day-to-day business. And the Global Compact provides a forum in which business and civil society and labor organizations can get together and talk about how to develop practical approaches to these rather high-level issues. Now, the Compact has been severely criticized by many as being voluntary and just talk or blue wash. I think that's a little unfair, because when companies sign up, they have to do so in a letter supported by their board, and they commit to report publicly on what they're doing in each of these areas. And if they don't do it, they get expelled from the Compact, and many thousands have been expelled because people sign up with enthusiasm and then don't do anything. These reports are available for public scrutiny and can be used by civil society to hold business to account. So while the Global Compact remains voluntary, it is driven by other things. Shareholder interest, for example, is building, and a spin-off of the Global Compact, something called the Principles for Responsible Investment, which has been adopted by about 1,000 major long-term investors, mainly pension funds, who together manage funds of, I think, $33 trillion, an unbelievable sum, who have committed to use the principles of the Global Compact and reports prepared by companies relating to their performance in their decisions. And at the same time, those principles have been baked into things like the performance standards of the IFC and the World Bank, and are supported by the banking sector equator principles, which I think were referred to indirectly in the introduction. So my first recommendation for the G8 and G20 governments would be to support and facilitate this process of business and civil society working together and developing a form of soft power. They could encourage reporting, open reporting in their own countries along the lines I've talked about, and they could also support the United Nations Global Compact local networks, which are present in more than 100 countries. And those local networks incorporate businesses of all sizes, big, little, national, international, coming together to work on the principles. The multi-stakeholder nature of those networks is absolutely fundamental. And the concept of that work is not just a Western conceit. Countries such as China and India and Brazil have networks and have recognized the benefits, and their governments actually support the compact. Networks are present in all G20 countries except Saudi Arabia. For example, there are over 300 Chinese companies in the compact, and the Chinese local network a couple of weeks ago, Mary will be very pleased to hear, is strong and held a workshop on human rights, which is quite something for China. None of that absolves governments from their responsibilities. Businesses are, I think, the process, the responsibilities of business and governments were set out, I think, in John Ruggie's great work on the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And Ruggie made a clear distinction between a state's responsibility to protect the human rights of its people and business responsibility to respect those rights. He also added a very important third element of remedy. Businesses are clearly not responsible for all the actions or omissions of the governments in countries in which they operate. But they can contribute positively, but only provided they diligently respect these other rights. And I think that process identified by Ruggie in human rights can be extended to other areas. For many years, there's been pressure on businesses to withdraw from countries in which abuses occur. And this was debated quite heatedly in the resources session a few nights ago. A responsible business operating to international standards, such as those of the Compact, and respecting internationally accepted norms, I think can make a contribution to the economy, working with others in society to build capacity and raise standards of governance quite apart from any economic impact. But it clearly depends on responsibility and on a need to build trust. And that brings me to another recommendation for the G8 or G20. There's been a tendency of Western governments, particularly in the G8, to attempt to isolate governments which are guilty of human rights or other abuses and which don't have representative governments. Now, I think the expression of disapproval is entirely understandable, although one has to admit that the selection of targets has actually been remarkably inconsistent and has been strongly influenced by perceptions of allies or spheres of influence, which clearly lead to charges of hypocrisy or bias. Just think about the case of Iran. For more than 30 years, the United States has led largely Western efforts to isolate and impose sanctions on Iran. From my own experience, every time in the 90s, when trying to do business, sanctions prevented this. The technocrats you were dealing with lost power, and the extremists gained power and were pushed aside. And that was not the only consequence. As a result of the private sector being choked off, and any foreign investment also being choked off, economic activity is increasingly in the hands of the government and the government's friends and cronies. And now, with very strict financial sanctions, the private sector has been devastated, and that has serious impacts on the population at large. And that's not to condone or support in any way the present Iranian government, but just to point out that our Western efforts over the last 20 years have, in my opinion, contributed to the situation. Had we done it differently, the face and attitude of the Iranian government would have been different, and perhaps we should look at China. That's a difficult proposition to prove. But the alternative, I think, could hardly have been worse. In Burma, the West also chose to impose sanctions, and the ASEAN countries deliberately chose not to, but expressed their criticism. Clearly, the very steadfast approach of Aung San Suu Kyi played an important part, including her eventual preparedness to move forward in what one could say is a less than perfect situation. So I think the ASEAN approach was more effective. So my second recommendation for G8 governments would be that they should honestly sit back and review what our policies for the past decades of isolation and sanctions, let alone military intervention, has actually delivered, and consider instead what a policy of trade and engagement could bring about. It could create an environment which was very different, in which businesses of all types, large and small, could work to create the wealth necessary for society to develop. It doesn't mean condoning or ignoring the manifest failings of many governments. It just means abandoning the use of economic sanctions as a weapon, except in highlighting and targeting the offshore wealth of various leaders. I think sanctions could be replaced by softer power of social and economic engagement. But there is a proviso that companies, and indeed the social and cultural organizations who are engaging in this, behave in ways which respect the major UN conventions. That's not going to be easy to achieve, nor to monitor performance, and there will undoubtedly be mistakes. That means it's also incumbent on G8 and G20 governments to ensure that the mechanisms by which remedy for damages can be enforced against those organizations and companies which cause it, and whereby companies in their own jurisdictions can be held to account. It's not possible to advocate that sort of thing engaging in countries with weak governance without also addressing corruption. Perhaps the greatest global threat to economic and social development and governance. And any attempt to address corruption has to involve all parties. So a third recommendation for the G8 is that while continuing to support the collective efforts through things such as the EITI to work the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, talked about last week in the Resources Programme, but they should work to ensure that the beneficial ownership of property in G8 countries and elsewhere is transparent, and ensuring that corrupt proceeds can't be hidden in G8 financial systems and shadow corporations in this city and others. The principles of the UN Convention Against Corruption, agreed by member states, including the parts on asset recovery, should be fully implemented. And at the same time, G8 countries could continue to tighten their own controls on corruption and legislation against corruption. But finally, I'd say there's probably no more egregious example of corruption than corruption in the international arms trade, quite apart from the human misery caused. Perhaps through a misconceived perception of national interest, this is able to reach into and distort parts of society in even the most sophisticated political systems. And the G8 could show a bit of collective leadership in this area. Now, Mary will be wondering how I've got so far in this talk without addressing climate, which Martin Wolf did extremely ably in the FT a couple of weeks ago. The topic was addressed in lectures, mainly through references to alternative energy and energy efficiency and so on. But frankly, the progress in the last 15 years in any sort of international agreement and international carbon pricing mechanism, supported by many in business, has been dispiritingly low. And the panel yesterday, I think it was David Miliband, who said he thought that a global agreement on climate was unlikely in the foreseeable future. I must say I confess to being somewhat resigned to this and to it happening on a kind of piecemeal basis as a result of corporations and others, consumers, looking for more efficient and less carbon-intensive methods, buttressed and supported by the work of things like the Carbon Disclosure Project. I think that China, surprisingly, which has on its own volition set quite challenging targets on energy efficiency per unit of GDP and carbon efficiency, may surprise us all, and that would remove one of the big obstacles to a global agreement. Meanwhile, I think we better all prepare and start preparing for adaptive measures. Unfortunately, while I think in the developed world we will probably be able to handle this quite reasonably, the real impact will be felt in the poorer countries such as Bangladesh, which can ill afford adaptation. In the debate on capital, there was agreement that regulation on capital was needed. It was pointed out that the major growth in Korea and Taiwan had occurred in countries with significant capital regulations. Yet, in many African countries, a lot of capital will be needed for infrastructure development. And there's clearly, I don't have to say it almost, an urgent need for changes in international structures on taxation. Progressive companies, such as mining companies, I think already report on what taxes they pay to whom and where, as well as their supply chain expenditure. And greater transparency would clearly be beneficial. But there's also a great need for transparency between governments. And given the nature of modern business and the sourcing of materials, a lot of work is needed to ensure that tax is paid in the country in which operations take place and profits are actually earned. It's relatively easy and quite popular in governments to point at apparently anomalous tax behaviors and practices, sometimes reprehensible by companies. But these, frankly, stem from outdated systems which governments set up, and governments need to change them. It won't be easy to do it because they're going to be winners and losers, but it's something that should be a top priority. Lastly, you'll be pleased to hear, as G8 and G20 countries turn their minds to the post-2015 development goals, they have to address and think about population growth and food. If we have a population of 9 billion by the middle of the century, even if 9 billion is a maximum, and numbers and changes in diet are going to require a very large increase in food supply. Now, there's enormous waste in rich countries, but this, in my opinion, is more a matter of individual behavior and societal behavior than anything that governments can do anything about. But on the supply side, efficiency in agriculture in much of Africa and elsewhere is going to have to be radically increased in yields, in prevention of loss, in processing, and in access to markets. And as happened long ago in rich countries, it's going to result in a movement of people from country to cities. China is addressing this trend more successfully in that it doesn't have slums than many countries in the past, but with clearly controversial methods of controlling the movement of people and having a very large migrant labor force of 150 million or so. To solve this problem without collateral damage is going to require a lot of careful governance and work. We're going to have make sure that there is great care that the existing rural population isn't simply disenfranchised or dispossessed. And I think companies such as Unilever and Nestle, normally quite unpopular in some circumstances, have for many years demonstrated that you can install basic processing equipment and develop scalable industries. And that process is happening in China and in Brazil. So my last recommendation for the G8 would be to look at that, identify examples that work, and make sure that we can replicate them. Success, I think, could generate a great deal of wealth. Failure could result in dispossessed and dissatisfied people and more awful slums. So, in summary, recommendations for the G8 would be a very strong focus on transparency, including comprehensive company reporting using indicators such as the GRI and integrated reporting systems. To support business and civil society working together in movements such as the Global Compact, particularly in local networks. to review the consequences of more than 3 decades of economic sanctions and military interventions and consider whether policies of trade and engagement might not have been better, and what could be done to ensure that companies engaged in that respect international norms. Transparency again, not just supporting efforts such as the EITI, but ensuring transparency of the beneficial ownership of assets and facilitating asset recoveries, and perhaps applying that to the arms industry as well. Climate, I think it's extremely important, but I'm not sure that the G8 is the forum to discuss it. I don't think they'll make any progress anyway. On taxation, there's clearly a great need for revision of international agreements coupled with transparency. In the meantime, companies, I think, can contribute to this by a great deal more transparency in what they pay, to whom and where. And lastly, feeding 9 billion people is going to require not just less waste of food in rich countries, which is up to all of us, but harnessing the productivity of land in poorer countries. And doing that without dispossessing or disempowering people is going to be a big challenge. I think transparency is key to all of these recommendations, as is the need to involve different sectors of society. And actually, if you look at all of those recommendations, they don't fit so badly into David Cameron's proposed agenda of tax, transparency, and trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that thoughtful address and for being specific in your recommendations. I was interested that in the key first recommendation about supporting a process of business and civil society working together, you did once mention organised labour, whereas in fact the Global Compact makes organised labour a partner in that, and it does make a difference if they are part of that broad process of partnership. And I think that's... I was very glad that you referenced John Ruggie's work and his guidelines on business and human rights, which I think set a real standard of the responsibility of governments, the responsibility of business, and the need for better remedies. I am, of course, very disappointed that you don't feel, as I do, that the G8 should actually utterly take on climate change as one of its priorities, but maybe we can have that as part of a discussion later, because if we don't get that right, there is no sustainable future, and all the rest is aspiration in a worrying and unsafe world if we go too far above the 2 degrees Celsius, which at the moment we're heading towards. But allow me to retreat from being too inclined to express my own strong views and instead come back to my excellent panel. I'm delighted that Paul Collier has caught the right train and been able to join us from Oxford. I think, Paul, if that's all right with you, maybe I'll let you... Do you want to speak first? You are sort of first on the list, but I was...
Fine, yeah.
Okay.
How long have I got?
You've got 10 minutes maximum.
Right.
Okay, so now that you're here and you've had time to settle, I'm happy to introduce you. Okay.
Sorry, was I supposed to speak from here?
Well, I did sort of say that that we could speak. I think, are you mic'd up?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, sit down then.
Okay. I've kind of been involved in the G8 agenda, so David Cameron is keen on my work, and so actually asked me to set the development part of the agenda. So let me say what it is and sort of justify why it is what it is, and then say what you could do beyond it. The agenda starts with... I should say that my first advice was don't preach, African governments are just sick to death of being preached at by British governments, and don't promise to double aid or double this or double that when clearly G8 governments have absolutely no appetite or capacity to deliver on that. So don't preach and don't promise. Focus on putting your own house in order in ways that are helpful for poor countries. Just recognize that the G8's own house is not in order, and by putting it in order, you can do yourselves a favor, ourselves, and help poor countries. So, and then focus down. Don't try and do a laundry list. Get real. So this is, I like to think, a G8 which is not theatrical. I think Glenn Eagles was a lot of pomp and fluff and theatre. That behind the Blair saves Africa was forget about Iraq, and that's, I feel, what was going on.
Paul, I have bad news. You haven't got 10 minutes. The panel has 10 minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's not your fault. It's my fault. I misread my instructions as I was advised. But so a concentrated focus, which you're giving.
I've come a long way for 2 minutes. What can we do that really helps others? One is corporate tax. Clearly, the rules need changing. It's become a nuisance to the G8 countries ourselves, but it's been a scandal in Africa for 30 years. And so addressing corporate tax avoidance is a really important thing. Second, money laundering. African governments can't do much about money laundering, but it's the easiest point at which to fix corruption, at which to close corruption down. Money laundering is the getaway car for bribe money. And who's doing that? It's not lawyers in Africa, it's lawyers in London. Lawyers linked to bankers. So go for the facilitators. The G8 can clean this up, even though African governments can't. And so that's the second area, beneficial ownership. Actually crack that. Then the third is transparency in extractives, which is kind of not a new agenda, but we can actually move it into the domain of from voluntary to enforcement by mandatory reporting. And Europe's just done that. America's done it. We could try and scale that across the G8. So those are three sort of attainable putting our own house in orders. When I say attainable, they won't be fixed in this G8, but there'll be a process will be launched which will, I hope, be unstoppable. For example, you'll notice that the secrecy havens, there's been more movement in the secrecy havens in the last 3 months than in the previous 10 years. And that's the shockwave in advance to the G8. What else can we do? Finance for African infrastructure. There are huge pools of capital in Western financial markets that are basically at the margin yielding nothing, and huge needs in Africa where the rate of return will be really very high. And it's trying to get a risk architecture which will enable African infrastructure to tap into global financial markets. That hasn't happened yet, but the G8 will make a start on devising a financial architecture which will include using public risk capital, public insurance schemes like a scaled-up MEGA to try and get an architecture which links these huge needs for billions of dollars of infrastructure with these deep pools of capital. What will the G8 not do? I mean, so all those items need to be followed up. What will the G8 not do, which I'd have liked it to do, but it's just proved politically too difficult, not because of Britain. I'd have liked it to see the economic partnership agreements in the European Union superseded. The deal I've been advocating for some years, which the African Union's keen on, is that instead of Europe saying we'll liberalise against Africa if Africa liberalises against Europe, say we'll liberalise against Africa if Africa liberalises against itself. So market access to Europe as a carrot for deeper market access within Africa. I hope that will happen, but it'll happen through the European Union rather than the G8 and in due course. Just a flip remark on climate change. Let me then push back, Mary, and suggest that actually the right forum for climate change is not the G8, it's the G20, because nearly all the big increase in emissions will come from the 12, not the 8. And I would like to see us getting really practical on climate change and concentrate on one thing that has to happen if we're to tackle climate change. We have to close down the world's coal industry. And so instead of all these woolly targets about degrees and emissions and so on, I would just like a practical agenda for a sequential closure of the world's coal industry. Because if we don't do that, we certainly won't address climate change. That's the most polluting emission. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Don't worry, it was worth your train journey. It's not just your initial words. We're going to have a panel discussion, and then we're going to open it to this very attentive audience. And you have overlapped a little bit, or more than a little bit, with Mark on some of the areas that you have talked about for the agenda of the G8. So I think, and you've added other areas, in particular in relation to African infrastructure and the interesting moving away from the EU partnership agreements. And we'll debate climate change later. I'll get into that myself, I think, when the time comes. But now it gives me great pleasure to invite Jamie Drummond. You're short at this stage, so we can have a conversation. So I'll leave it to you to be as disciplined.
I'll be brief. And first of all, we've got a great event outside, which you're all welcome to after the various proceedings here. And there'll be a wonderful film shown on the walls of the Tate Modern at about 10 o'clock tonight. After this has safely finished, if that's okay, you're all very welcome. It's actually an amazing film Richard Curtis made. And it's relevant to tonight's subject. It's part of something called Agitate. And it's about getting the general public more engaged in the policy issues that the G8 are looking at. Exactly the things that Paul and Mark have already spoken about. There's not a lot that I disagree with in what Paul said about this G8. I think that what I'd like to particularly add is this morning, Europe passed a law, finally. There's been many iterations of the finalization of this law regarding transparency in the extractive sector. Now, that law was passed because hundreds of thousands of people bothered to take action. They turned up in people's parliamentary offices, congressional district offices. They signed petitions, some of them. Those who dismiss clicktivists are wrong. We need people to take actions, even small ones, as well as large ones. And the pressure that the companies felt and the governments felt has resulted in significant policy change. And if people didn't get off their backside sometimes and take action, these policy changes wouldn't happen. And it is essential that there is a more informed global citizenry. This is subject here, I believe, is global citizenship. A more informed global citizenry taking action and keeping politicians, put it like this, working with the politicians on the inside who want to do the right thing and holding the politicians who do not want to do the right thing accountable. I don't like the idea that we're always about finger-wagging at politicians. The ones who are good need help. They need a hell of a lot of help. The ones who aren't need to be held accountable aggressively. And often the ones who want to do the right thing actually encourage more pressure. I want to correct, if I may, or disagree and have an argument with Paul about 2005. I don't think what Blair was about was purely about Iraq. It was in response to a multi-year campaign by the British public to do more in development. That's what it was about. And we campaigned very hard for that over many years, and it manifested in bilateral debt cancellation, multilateral debt cancellation, and that's where the promises of aid came from. It came because we all asked for it. It wasn't some whimsical gesture by the political elites. It's actually something we all campaigned for, millions of people across the country. Some people may think that was the wrong ask, but it is actually what we asked for them to do. And by the way, as a matter of feedback, it would be utterly irresponsible for campaigners to ask people to take action, politicians to change policies, and then not give people feedback on what happened. And one enormous failure, which I think a lot of people should be held accountable for outside of politics, is why is it that nobody knows the good news? We're going to hear a lot of bad news about some trends through to 2030 that should worry everyone in the room about climate change, population growth, and so on. But the great news is that a lot of this campaigning together has worked. It has achieved results. Debt cancellation cancelled $110 billion of debt. The campaigns on AIDS has helped put 9 million, now 9 million people who otherwise would not be on these life-saving drugs are on these drugs. 300 million people have been vaccinated, saving 5.4 million lives. Child deaths down by 2.65 million a year in the last decade. That's, I think it's something like 7,000 kids not dying a day. And Mary, you're very involved, obviously, in the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization and know about some of these statistics. This stuff happened because people came together and pressed politicians to take action. I doubt very many people in this room know about the results of all of this activism. And that's a huge problem that I think people need to come together and address, which is, why do you not know the good news? But the reason I'm saying that good news is not just to say, hey, everything's on track, it's all going to be fine. It's because, I feel passionately that if people don't know that activism works, don't know that pressing the G8 like we have gathered next week work, then why would you get engaged? And we have a problem. We have a lot of people who are not sufficiently engaged in these issues. And we need to find more creative ways. We're trying one outside right now and inside here to try and get people more engaged in these issues. Because if we don't, there's two essential trends, you could say, in the Global Trends 2030 report by the National Intelligence Council, which I'm sure you've all read, which says, on the one hand, we've got this massive population growth, we've got a massive increase in the middle classes, they're all going to want the stuff that we have here, quite right. And on the other hand, and that's all pointing towards, going after resources which are in very vulnerable parts of the world, and that's going to cause all conflicts, and we've got to worry about that. We've got climate change compounding the problem. A lot of these resources are in places that exemplify what we call the three extremes: extreme poverty, extreme climate, and extreme ideology. And, trying to manage that is going to be very difficult into our future, through to 2030 and beyond. Against that, we have these more economically and politically empowered, socially connected, technologically connected people around the world who don't necessarily always obey what's going on within their country. They're global citizens, the point of this evening. And if we can help connect those people around the world, help them take bad politics out of good policy, and try and push the better policies through and stop the dumb policies, we've got a shot at not screwing this up in the next 15, 20 years. But if we don't connect those people, we don't help provide them with that information so that they aren't in a position to hold politicians accountable or help the good ones, I think we're in trouble. So we've got to scale up the kind of campaigning that I think we've seen in this country work very well. And I think we're seeing it work quite well right now with this government, though there's a lot more to be done. It's actually, there's some real progress has been made, and we've got some good things on the agenda for the G8, which I haven't really talked about very much because Paul said it all. But I wanted to make that bigger point about campaigning works, events and forums like this work. We need more of them, and we need people more engaged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. People power matters, the importance of being engaged and indeed increasingly trying to make connections with global citizens in other countries and other parts of the world to hold governments accountable and try to press for progressive reforms. My last speaker on the panel, Strive Masiyiwa, you're from the continent that we've touched on a little bit, so you have a particular authority on this panel to instruct or push back or more than anything else advise the G8 on what really would be helpful.
Thank you, Mary. I had my opportunity last year, as you know, to advise the G8. I was invited to the summit by President Obama. And as we were preparing for this, we spent weeks on end preparing for it. And then somebody told me that, you know, you're only going to get 2 minutes.
Just like this panel, yes.
There was no panel discussion after. But they're a bit more generous with the time. Can I have another 2 minutes? Thank you. You know, Jamie talked of good news. And there's a lot of good news coming out of Africa at the moment, particularly on the economic front. I mean, this is real good news. When we talk about the GDP growth, we talk about the fact that out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, 6 are African. That's been sustained now for over a decade. Governance. You know, I say this quite often, which surprises people, that there's been an extraordinary improvement in governance. Coming off a low base, yes. But Africa is very well governed these days. If you've lived there all your life, like me, well, most of my life. If you're a businessman, we've never been able to travel across Africa and do business in Africa as Africans to the scale that we are able to do today. And that is good news. But I'm on the Africa Progress panel, and I've been part of the process of compiling the report on where Africa is. And the issue that brings me today for us to discuss is our report this year, which are the natural resources. And Africa's natural resources are playing a particular role in the good news in terms of economic growth. But there are challenges there, which is that of equitable growth and development. We have not, with all this good news, we are not seeing real impact on poverty alleviation. The levels of unemployment, if we spoke statistically, are extraordinary. Over 40% in quite a number of these countries that are resource rich. How do we take something that's been in the womb of the earth for millions of years and bring it to the surface to the benefit of everybody? I think the core guiding principle must be use it in a manner which is as sustainable as possible, as generational as possible. Infrastructure, education, health, addressing abject poverty, and ensuring equitable growth. I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Strive. Okay. We now actually have some time in the panel before I open it to the floor to discuss some of the issues that you have been addressing. And since I think all of you in one way or another addressed the issue of natural resources, I'd like to maybe tie it to one of the recommendations. I think it was the second recommendation that Mark mentioned as to whether we need a different approach to governments that are not adhering to standards of governance and human rights, but have as to whether they should be isolated or whether we should do business with them. And he referenced, for example, Burma, Myanmar in the past. And I say that because I think very often it's because there are natural resources and minerals in those countries that people are willing to do business with them. So who wants to take up that challenge of whether there is a better way of trying to encourage good governance in these countries by being willing to do business, or whether it's better to address through different types of sanctions. Paul, perhaps I could ask you to open up on this.
Yeah, sure. I think Strive is right that the issue here, I think of it as stewardship, really, that the present generation in Africa have a responsibility of stewardship for depleting these natural assets, and needs to hand on to the next generation other assets of at least equal value, preferably stuff that's more productive. And so getting a narrative of good stewardship across the continent is enormously important, and that is a core role for leadership. But it's fundamentally African leadership that's needed there. I'm wary of the G8 getting on a high horse and preaching to Africa what Africa's got to do, basically. I think that's a bit but Mary's issue of, should there be rules which say in some conditions companies shouldn't really get involved in depletion? And I think that the answer is probably yes. That, for example, in the early transition in DRC, when there was a transitional government, ministers in that government knew that they'd only got a short period of power because it was a transitional government, and they sold off assets very cheaply in a context where all that was going to happen was they were going to enrich themselves, basically. And so I suggested at the time there needed to be some rules which said, no, this is not an appropriate context. A real issue at the moment is Somalia. Just last week I was with the Somali Minister of Finance and Minister of Natural Resources, and they actually struck me as really very decent and thoughtful people. But it's scarcely credible that Somalia is ready for a lot of high-value resource extraction, because the federal government doesn't even have control of its territory yet. And so what's happening at the moment in exploitation in Somalia is actually heightening the risk of conflict as the various subnational entities compete with each other to claim more territory. So this is a potentially aggravating process at the moment. So there's something which held back. I think there'd be a good case for saying if there's no mining code, if there's no EITI, then companies should be very wary, basically. Just to come back to Strive's point about the Africa Progress Panel, which this year was magnificent, I must say, but the most striking numbers to me in that were that the capital outflows from over-invoicing and basically money laundering were more than double the aid inflow. And so if we could actually address money laundering and over-invoicing, and that is within the G8's power to do something about that, that is going to make a bigger impact on Africa now than promises to increase aid which we then don't keep. So I think the Africa Progress Panel really reinforced the case for doing this agenda of corporate taxation and beneficial ownership.
Thank you, Paul. I must say I also welcomed the Africa Progress Panel in a particular way because I now have a responsibility as the United Nations Special Envoy for the Great Lakes and the DRC. And we have a framework that was signed on the 24th of February by 11 heads of state and is guaranteed by the 4 key institutions, the UN, the African Union, the International Conference, the Great Lakes and SADC. And it has 2 oversight mechanisms, one a regional one to stop supporting armed groups, to stop supporting bad perpetrators, to stop exploiting in other countries. And the other is the national mechanism in the DRC itself. And one of the key issues is going to be how to address this issue of natural resources. Yeah. And it's going to be fundamentally, it's going to, and the exploitation of conflict minerals has been part of the problem of the terrible sexual violence against women and girls. So it's very much tied in.
I was in DRC last week addressing on natural resources.
Yeah, I think we'll have to try to bring together, a sort of expert. The EU, as you say, has just passed legislation. There's the EITI. There's the African panel. Somehow we've got to bring all this together to discuss. Yeah. Jamie?
Well, Paul's written about this plenty, and I'm sure you've all got his books. But there's one thing that I think there's a distinction between countries which, have governance of some variety that is not necessarily generally considered the worst, but natural resource addiction and complications coming with that are already very entrenched, versus countries which, for the first time roundabout now, are discovering that they've got a truckload of resources the world wants. And there you have, not to forget about the countries that are already down a certain kind of slippery slope, but tactically and opportunistically to see where you can get ahead of the curve and try and help things not go horribly wrong. The Tanzanias, the Mozambiques, and so on would be a good use of people's time and resources. Though, of course, Mozambique's discovered a lot of coal, and I'm not sure how they would respond to your comment about coal. And they'd probably say, fine, if you're prepared to write a cheque for, I don't know, a couple of $1 billion a year to replace the revenues that they will not be getting from selling that coal to the Chinese. I don't know if you've had that conversation with the Mozambican finance minister.
Can I leap in hot pursuit? What would be a sensible plan for closure of the world's coal industry? I think it would be, the key word is sequence. That you start with the richest countries and you work down and you say, we're not moving on to the next until whichever country is now in the top of the list actually moves. So Mozambique will be some years away. But it gives that way, instead of saying, this is everybody's problem, you try and turn it into a specific problem of one industry in one country at a time.
Right.
And that rather sort of concentrates responsibility, I think. That's the idea.
Can I share one thing that I just find really shocking that I think is focusing our minds at the moment regarding countries that are already down the slippery slope? Nigeria, a country that we all know is vital to so many concerns. And that country made somewhere between $50 and $60 billion for the last year that the EITI has accounts. In that same country, 1 in 11 children in the world who died under the age of 5 were Nigerian. And 1 in 7 women who died in the world in childbirth were Nigerian. By the way, mainly from northern Nigeria. And an absolute pandemic of mistreatment in the context of a country with extraordinary natural resource wealth. How is this possible? And what is the kind of activity that we as global citizens and the G8 as global policymakers who are trying to be helpful, not hurtful, what are the sort of things that we can do globally? And then specifically, what are the things that Nigerian citizens, anti-corruption campaigners, transparency campaigners, and so on, should and can be doing? And how can we help them? Because the anti-corruption campaigners in that country don't have it easy, and they need help.
Mark, I'd like to bring you back in this because that was one of your themes, in fact, in a way. And Nigeria is a country I think you know.
Yeah, I've lived there.
Yeah, for lots of reasons. How would you? I mean, it's part of what you're saying. We need a different approach to countries that have problems but need us to address them in a more nuanced way or more long-term way.
I think Paul's point about having a period in a country in confusion, a DRC and so on, of trying to have some kind of suspension of production of natural resources has some merits. The problem is that you could apply that to Western companies, but it wouldn't apply to everybody. So my approach tends to be much more to say, can we work with, in the extractive industries, with Chinese extractive companies and so on, and voluntarily, because it would have to be voluntarily, because the Chinese are not going to, and many other countries are not going to, and it's fine to say are not going to accept mandates, and you would never get a UN agreement on it. So in a messy world, you have to try and build coalitions, and that's why I'm enthusiastic about trying to get business people to say, because there is an international language of business, and they can actually see common advantages.
Have you got examples of Chinese companies that are willing to voluntarily accept?
Well, nobody's tried it.
Code of standards.
What? Oh yes, no, international standards. Yeah, many of the Chinese state companies. I mean, they have
and the Global Compact companies.
They have signed up to the thing. Fu Chenyu, who's the chairman of Sinopec, is on the Global Compact board, and he's a very intelligent person. And these are they're well aware of the problems, and China is well aware of the problems. I mean, they're aware of their internal problems. You had Wen Jiabao, who said, what was it, that their economy was coordinated, unsustainable, and something else, which I thought was refreshingly honest and could well be admitted by some of our Western leaders. So I just approach it from a different way, not to try and sit in the West. And I know you're all enormously excited about European Union legislation, US legislation, to make mining companies and oil companies report in the minutest detail as to what they've done with their money. Yeah, good, okay. I don't think it'll make a row of beans of difference, frankly, except to involve an enormous amount of work. The EITI countries, you have some kind of commitment from the government of that country. So when you talk about Tanzania or Mozambique, who I suspect are, I don't have the list in my head, are signatories of the EITI. Yep. Part of the commitment that they make is to set up civil society panels. And that, to me, even if corruption continues, if you have an independent civil society panel, it's huge progress.
One of the things that Paul mentioned is finance for African infrastructure, the risk architecture. Strive, maybe, you've talked about the way in which African countries are seeing unprecedented growth and very encouraging growth. I know this from my involvement in the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, that Africa is changing in many ways in a very positive way. But what about the problem of financing the infrastructure? Again, look at the DRC. The need for huge financing there.
Mary, 20 years ago, the statistic for telecommunications, the industry I come from, was that less than 1% of the African people, of the population, had access to a telephone in terms of what we call penetration. Today, most African countries are well over 70%. There's more than 600 million people in Africa with a cell phone, and that is infrastructure. I would love to see that in power. I'd like to see that in water. I'd like to see that in roads and ports. But when I talk about my industry, telecommunications, that would not have happened without China. China has funded most of that telecommunications infrastructure. The truth of the matter is, for telecoms entrepreneurs like myself to build networks in Zimbabwe and Burundi, we would not have got it out of Western banks. We got the money out of China. So if I were to give a recommendation, I wonder about when you should give the G8 a recommendation, because from my experience, things have been locked up now. But I would say, look at what China has been doing, because it is China, really, which we're talking to about ports and roads and railways There's a lot of talk in the West, but the truth is it's the Chinese who are coming to the party, and Africa is increasingly looking to the Chinese. I don't know whether we will be sitting and talking G8 meetings in 5 years' time that will be relevant to Africa, to be honest with you.
Except, if I may, the Chinese investment in Africa is large projects.
Sure.
Whereas, despite the statistic you mentioned and the wonderful spread of cell phone and the leapfrogging into communications with cell phones, which is remarkable, you still have, of the 1.3 billion who don't have access to electricity, or the 2.6 billion who still cook on coal and firewood and animal dung and ingest these fumes, a lot of them live in Africa, sure. And they're in rural communities. How do we get to the poorest with possibilities of renewable energy, off-grid, clean cook stoves, lights that are now available? Is it possible to use, for example, social protection systems, but then business doesn't work easily with the social protection systems in countries, but that's where the poor are known to be and identified.
That is so true. And like I said, we need to begin to, if we can duplicate in other areas like power, energy, what we were able to do in telecommunications. So there were lessons there. Principle to those lessons was creating the correct policy environment for the private sector to come in. Because that infrastructure was not built by governments, it was built by private companies. You can't run away from so African governments themselves must create a policy environment. I was in Nigeria only yesterday. Seems like a long time ago, and I was talking to the finance minister about, we were talking about this very issue, Ngozi, about energy. And she talked about all the great things they're doing to open up the power sector, and I said, Ngozi, still the people in the rural areas will not be on the grid. We have to look at solar power. And she said, yeah, we're talking about solar. I said, why don't you just start by removing some of the duties on simple things like solar lanterns so we can ship them in? And she's very smart, and she said they'll get it done. So, so I just wanted to comment on something earlier made by my colleague earlier on. You know, when the U.S. government passed the EFCC, the Anti-Corruption Act, when I read it, it was horrifying, just like the British Anti-Bribery Act. And my colleagues who, American businessmen and British business, first the Americans, talked, how can we do business in Africa? But you know, looking back at it today, and the conversations in the boardroom, because I see it from the boardrooms, where we are sitting with American partners, American directors. For the first time, the boardrooms were, how do we stop bribery? How do we stop corruption? How do we stop our people taking bribes? It works. That legislation works. The answer is not to knock it down, but to make it more global. So that the French are in, so that all the G8 are in. I would like to see the same platform of the Anti-Bribery Act, because you see, no matter what we do in Africa, and this is by no means to exonerate anybody in Africa, but to enforce, to pursue the kind of people who are involved in this type of... No African government has the capacity to do it. But when the U.S. Justice Department said, we will take out any director who pays, who is in a boardroom where bribery is taking place on the ground, no American companies will play around anymore. No British companies will play around anymore. It works.
So that's your recommendation to the G8?
Oh, absolutely. And
Mark has already made it. So
Let's get it gets done.
Yes.
Okay, it's painful. You know, people complained. Some said we're not going to do business in Africa. We're too liable, so forth. But you know what? People soon started to sit down and say, how do we get this done? Okay? I'd like to see it into the G20 with China and Brazil. Then we are talking. But for now, let's start with all the G8. Thank you.
Okay, excellent point. I'm now going to open it to the floor, because this is a panel about global citizenship, and you're as entitled to be involved as anybody. The gentleman in the white shirt was the first hand I saw, and just wait for the mic so that you can be heard. And there's another here, you're next, and I'm hoping I'll get a female. I'm looking for a woman at this stage, so I'm just to get some balance. Yes, okay, so you first. Yes, please.
Hi, I've got a question for the panel, and it's to do with resources. And peak oil will hit eventually.
Do you want to say who you are?
My name is Hussein Shafi. I'm part of an organisation called Lobby.
Okay.
And we were talking about resources, natural resources. So peak oil will eventually happen. And people were talking about we should have a stewardship of what happens to the natural resources. Well, guess what? Every single gram of every single resource that goes into making a mobile phone will eventually run out. Those are mostly come out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and one day they will run out. Those materials are going to be needed by society over the next million years. Over the last 100 years, civilization has moved so fast, so forward, basically, that we are going through natural resources at a rapid rate, and it's an increasing rate. It's not diminishing. So we are going to run out of resources very fast. So when you say stewardship should be regional countries in Africa, actually it's the responsibility on a planetary level. Everyone should be very careful what you're doing with the natural resources that belong to every single human being on this planet.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll put that to the panel. The gentleman here in this, and I'll take the woman over here, and then we'll go back to the panel for comments. Thank you. So please just identify yourself, and then,
Thank you. My name is Lennon. I'm a student. I just wanted to ask Mr. Masiyiwa an issue that may be closer home or not. What are your thoughts on Zimbabwe's situation in terms of the complexities that you just highlighted, China, natural resources, and sort of the developmental path the country has taken? Thank you.
Okay. I think that was for you, Strive. Yeah. Please, yes.
Thank you. My name is Bumi. I'm a reporter with Africa Today magazine. We have been here before. I'm directing to Madam Robinson. We've been here before. I've met you before. We have talked about several topics: poverty, human rights, war, Africa, hunger. And we are still here today, still beating this same drum. June 12, 2013. What has changed? What have we missed? The G8 is here again. The G8 will come again. Why are we still talking about the same thing? In fact, it's becoming clear that the G8 is not about the 8 heads of state. It's becoming a media spectacle. That is, I am a journalist. I know that. I agree. But it's becoming a journalist jamboree. That is the number of journalists that appears in this G8 that matters, not what the G8 achieves. What is different, Madam Robinson? Please.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that one later. I'll just take that one other question because I see another female hand there. I'm as you can see, I'm clearly biased. I'm going to be...
Hi, meu nome é Amélia Barakat. I work in Kew Gardens. It's just a general question is about the relationship between China and Brazil and China and India, and what the panel think, what are the positives about this relationship. And because from my point of view, it's actually very detrimental to the environment. And deforestation and the production of food, and that's why China probably is investing huge money in both countries, because exactly they need those lands, and there is a huge debate about how the effect on conservation of the forest and the species.
Okay. Thank you. I think we'll take these four and then I'll come back to the floor again. Paul, there was a question of resources and stewardship and peak oil, the role of the DRC. Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, okay. I don't... I mean, let me be honest and clear. I don't buy into these sort of doomsday concerns about running out over the next million years. Sheikh Yemeni got this right about 30 years ago. He was the head of OPEC, and he said the world didn't move on from the Stone Age because it ran out of stone. And we'll move on from the oil age. I doubt we'll move on from the oil age because we've run out of oil. We've already got more oil than we can safely burn consistent with climate change. So actually, some of the oil is going to have to be left in the ground. So, I'm an economist. So, economists basically, there's a very simple idea, which is that when stuff starts to get scarce, it gets expensive, and as it gets expensive, that induces innovation to find alternatives to it. And that's worked every time so far. The world is such an amazingly innovative place. The big resource of the world is not what's under the ground, it's what's in our heads. And so I just sort of rely on that. Can I just say, can I just respond quickly to a couple of the others?
Okay.
I mean, one, if you think that this year's G8 is all motivated by media spectacle, try explaining beneficial ownership to a big audience, right? I mean, the public relations people are worried that this is so technically complex an agenda that how on earth they're going to explain it to people? So I don't think it's a fair accusation to say it's been driven by media. And just a little remark to support the point that Chinese companies are not all rogues. That I remember I gave the keynote address at something called the International Conference on Business Ethics. It was in South Africa 2 or 3 years ago. And there, in the audience, were a whole row of Chinese, and they came up afterwards with an interpreter and said, this is the chief executive and his team of one of the really big Chinese companies, and we come to this International Conference on Business Ethics because we just try to understand how are we supposed to behave in Africa. We look at others, we see what they do, we see what's expected of us, basically bribes. What are we supposed to do? So the idea that they're rotten to the core and will be rogues, whatever, I just don't think is right. The G20 is a vital institution. It's a new institution, a vital institution. And it's not the case that we can just pass an agenda on from the G8 to the G20. But in some spheres, unless the G8 puts its house in order first, there isn't a hope of the G20 moving on it. So that seems to me a reasonable proposition. Let's clean up our own act and then hope that the G20, led by South Africa, say, well, these are issues important for Africa. We'll put them on the table.
Thank you. Strive, I think the student wanted you to develop some of your thinking on the African perspective. I mean, that's what I understood.
I have nothing to say about Zimbabwe. Thank you, my brother.
Okay, we'll leave that one since we're ranging more widely. Jamie, I'll come back to what has changed, but let me start with you. You followed G8 pretty closely, so what has changed from your perspective?
CNN once did a story of me calling me the G8 junkie, and I used to have the tragic existence where I'd follow every single subclause of each line of every communique paragraph, and I loved it, by the way. Something very strange happened to my head. And I was very excited when we got a clause in about extractive industries transparency, by the way, in 2003. And from these things, you know, and Blair, by the way, was moderately helpful on that in the early days, wasn't he?
He did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without him, it wouldn't have happened.
So, you know, I find myself also sometimes in the odd position of I was at the Genoa G8. And when you weren't allowed in, I was let in. What's that about? We were having an argument with, at that time, Condoleezza Rice about deeper debt cancellation and more moves on the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is helps third country fabric provisions, quite helpful in providing jobs in some countries in Africa. And so I suppose the point is those details matter. And the politicians put in those subclauses when we put enough pressure on them to do so. And you need to be partly in the room having a conversation with them, and partly having a conversation with the public about what's happening in the room. And those two things need to be going on. And I think we've seen quite a lot of specific important changes. My frustration is that we haven't taken those to scale. So I'm not trying to argue with you that everything's great. It so isn't. It so plainly isn't. But the specific things that we have worked on, when we've got our act together, we have made a difference. My frustration, I sense with all of us, is why haven't we taken to scale our ability to change policies, persuade the public? I just want to agree 100% with Paul. So we've got a team of people right now trying to explain what beneficial ownership is, what multilateral tax conventions are, what capacity building for the tax revenue collection authorities are. The reason all of this is incredibly important is because hopefully it will increase the tax base of developing nations so they can fund their own development and in due course very soon not require any aid from us at all. And that is, you know, aid is an incidental byproduct of a much better thing. Not needing aid is an incidental byproduct of a much better thing, which is that the domestic resources in developing nations can pay for the development of those countries. Just a fact to leave you with. In the 10 years since, or 12 years since I've been a G8 junkie, aid to Africa, for example, has doubled from $20 to $40 billion a year. That's not very much. It's something. But the big picture, the important thing, is that domestic resource mobilization within African countries has gone from 70 billion a year to 380 billion a year and will be 460 billion a year in a year and a half's time. That money and how it is spent is the really important question. How our aid can possibly help in not screw things up and maybe help a little bit in making sure some of that money is better spent is part of the things that we need to put on the table. A little bit. But you disagree. But let's have that conversation. Yeah, I'm sort of agreeing with you.
I think he's sort of saying,
that's what I'm saying.
Moving away
but there's
from
an important
aid
transition.
to,
you know, if you stopped aid right now, a lot of people would die, and that wouldn't be necessary.
Yeah.
So let's get the transition right.
Well,
I factually disagree with you there, I'm afraid.
Mark, the question from the woman from the Kew Gardens about China and Brazil, do you want to take that up a little bit? It's the wider, I think, G20. The readjustment of power in our world.
I'm actually quite optimistic about China because I think they're unusual in having not a democratic government, but they have an extremely technocratic government. They're run by engineers. They've let an economist in, but most of them are engineers. The previous premier was a geologist, like me, so he must have been a good thing. And they're extremely rational. And they have quite consciously, I think, gone for... And they've had a remarkable progress on poverty alleviation with systems which are, from our point of view, by no means perfect. One-child policies, hukou systems,
and are they doing
preventing...
enough on the environment? I think that was the thrust of the question.
I think they are now coming to the environment, and I think they are as I said, they've set targets on energy intensity. They set them 5 years ago, and they've met them. They're the only country in the world which actually sets a target, which is a rational target, which says we want to limit energy intensity per unit of GDP, which is what we all ought to be, and carbon emission. So I think, they'll get there. And as I said in my talk, I think they will actually help greatly in climate. I'm not just on, if I'm allowed one comment on Paul, I agree absolutely with Paul's statement on resources, except I think on fossil fuels, like you, if it wasn't for climate, I would be entirely relaxed about the using up of them, because I don't think we'd ever get to the end. The problem is with climate, there is an element of urgency in there which trumps economics.
So you agree then that part of the fossil fuel will become stranded assets because we won't be able to use them?
Yes, I think. I mean, if it wasn't for climate, I agree with Paul. It wouldn't all be used anyway because we'd have found something else better, more convenient.
And now we have to do it more urgently.
Yeah, okay. Urgency is the problem.
I'm going to go for 2 more questions to the audience. I think that's probably all we have time for. You and then the gentleman behind. Yes, Adam. Just wait for the mic, and then, if you wouldn't mind, just identifying yourself. Yeah.
Barbara Frost from WaterAid. I found that a really stimulating discussion. Thank you very much. And it set me thinking. We've been campaigning for a world where everybody has safe water to drink and decent sanitation, toilets, because we know that that's one of the areas that's really holding back economic and social development. And we work through citizens' action and people's movements. But looking ahead in our next strategy or our next few years, who should we work with? Should we be working with governments? Should we be working far more with the private sector? And how should we work as an NGO that's really trying to bring about change in something very basic, water and sanitation?
Thank you very much. Very good question. The gentleman in the few rows behind. Yeah. Is anybody absolutely desperate to ask a question? I could take maybe one more. If somebody's absolutely desperate, all right, we'll take you.
My name is Joseph Ochieno. I write and commentate on African affairs. I would just like to make a quick observation to the G8 that perhaps they should spend less on figures and statistics and probably visit African villages like I do, and that they'll probably realize, like in my own village in Uganda, what I saw when I was growing up in the 1970s is not necessarily what is there today when it comes to health and education. In fact, the education I had helped me reach where I am amidst all the wars. The only other thing, though, is that for you, Mary, in your other capacities, if you don't mind, going to Congo, since it's already been mentioned, I wonder whether the G8 could work with you slightly more, the UN, and follow up the challenges about the pending issues in DRC, especially referring to the 2 countries, namely Uganda, my own, and Rwanda, who are named as net contributors to crisis in that country. And I'm saying so because I'm simply concerned that there's a lot going on the continent, and I write on these issues, and I've been talking about it today. But I rather think that there's an element of impunity within the continent by a minority clique of established leaders with good ears in the West, and many of the G8 countries simply because nobody else is able to tell them who to have conversations with on the continent.
Okay, thank you for those thoughts. Now, there was a gentleman there with an urgent question, and then I'll come back to the panel briefly. And yeah.
Hi, I'm Cheval from the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is right behind you, actually. I want to make a quick point, actually. It's Malaysia and not China who's the biggest foreign direct investor in Africa. Secondly, in relation to that point, there was mention of sort of, I think it was Paul who was mentioning it earlier, about developing the financial architecture to try to figure out how to channel capital into Africa. What surprises me so far is that there's been no mention of the G8 itself actually investing in Africa. It's more, you've talked more about sort of a role of facilitation, an advisory role, but less about sort of directing capital, not in the form of aid, into developing nations. And I just want to sort of get your feedback on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Interesting point. So the first question from water aid, safe water and sanitation, who to work with. I'll invite anybody from the panel.
All these sessions are recorded and streamed, and you can get them on the internet. And I really would recommend that you watch the one from Monday night with Paul Polman. You've seen it.
I'm sold.
Yeah, exactly. Well, okay. So I think what you need to do is to find. Well, I mean, Unilever makes a business out of it, selling soap, basically, but he does it with a passion, as soap as being a benefit. He's selling a social good. Now, I regard selling oil as a social good, but not everyone would agree. He does it very passionately. So watch it. It's really very good.
Yeah. In fact, if I can put that in a different way, Paul Polman was also a member of the high-level panel that's just reported on the post-2015 agenda, and the title is really Global Partnerships. And I think that's probably the wisdom of the global partnerships being government, private sector, NGOs, wider civil society, women's groups, social sectors that are increasingly becoming involved. The informal sector organising, which I think is becoming a real partner on these issues as well. The next point was really, I think, the challenges of impunity, which I certainly relate to, and I can very much take what you said about the need to address these issues, particularly in the context of the Great Lakes, but also what you said about the need to know what's happening in villages and link the voices of those who really know what's happening in food and nutrition security, for example, access to energy, with those who have power and influence. But I want to pass on the question of investment, the G8 investing in Africa, perhaps both to Paul and to Strive. Maybe you first, Strive.
You know, when in 2006, when then Senator Obama came to Africa, we had a wonderful conversation about investment in Africa. And last year I was amazed when we went there. That was the first question he asked me about American companies investing in Africa. He said, "Where are we?" And I'll tell you what I said to him. You know, if I were charging consultancy fees for every American company that is inquiring about investing in Africa at the moment, I could start another business. When we talk about investment, G8 investment, of course we're talking about companies. It's about a Unilever. It's about a GE. It's about an IBM. One of the most exciting observations we are seeing is tremendous interest and movement. It's not across the whole of Africa, but certainly I would say it's encouraging. China, of course, we see government-related investment where the state is participating through China Development Bank, but it's a different model. But I think the interest from G8 companies, investment funds, for example, private equity funds, looking at Africa today. There is so much money from private equity funds for Africa. The actual problem is getting what they call good deal flow. The banks, the Barclays, the Standard Chartered, the South African companies, I mean, we talk about the West, but corporate South Africa is moving up north at an incredible pace. So, that's good news for you. Thank you.
Paul, can I invite you?
There's an enormous amount of international business interest in Africa. Most is not within its comfort zone yet. So I think there's a role for public risk capital in just bringing this huge wave of interest into its comfort zone. And just let me finish with an example of where that worked, and it's mobile phones and Mo Ibrahim. I was with Mo last night. One of the things that really helped Mo get going, because he went round before, he was a telecoms engineer. That was his doctorate, and he saw an opportunity, and he went round the big international telecoms companies and said, why don't you do this in Africa? And they all said, no. And so he thought, I'll do it myself. And then he needed risk capital. And at that time, CDC, Old Commonwealth Development Corporation, was in the business of public risk capital. And so they funded him. And that's one of the things that really got Mo going. CDC then stepped out of the business of public risk capital and has just stepped back in it this last year. And that seems to me, that public risk capital role, to be really the future of aid, if you like, that just gearing up so that you bring private business into its comfort zone into Africa. Because Africa sorely needs modern private business.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Jamie, a last thought?
Well, quite a few. Is this a wrapping up moment, or what
is it? But a short one.
All right. I mean, there's one sort of massive, I think, piece of schizophrenia about a lot of this, which is when we're calling for investment into Africa and trying to get away from the aid narrative, for example, into that trade and investment and partnership narrative, which we're, amongst others, trying to be part of, the Africa Rising, not do that, the old stuff that's a legacy of the 80s in certain ways. And then as soon as you get into that, you're suddenly accused of, it's land grabs, it's investment, it's the nasty private sector and all the rest of it. And I think we need a kind of really intelligent conversation with civil society about what really makes sense here. We're having a big old fight right now with George Monbiot, who's accusing something called the New Alliance, which has just recently been now moved to be, really part of the AU's Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Programme, snappy acronym called CADP. And he's attacking it, not knowing that it's really an African-led initiative, African farmers behind it, calling for African investment, and most of the investors in it are African, private sector. But he thinks that because he wants to believe that it's a rapacious, Western, nasty capitalist takeover of Africa in part of a new scramble for Africa with the Chinese. And that might make for a headline-grabbing narrative. But actually, it's sort of just people saying, what does African agriculture need? It needs some investment. How can we help get that in? Here's a way. And I think we need to kind of have a bit more of a more mature debate with those who are traditionally the friends of development, who also have a sort of a knee-jerk anti-private sector bias. Need to kind of get over some of that. So that's a sort of a broad point about private sector investment. Just a very quick thing on the G8. I wish we didn't live in a world where the G8 really mattered, and I wish we didn't live in a world where celebrities sometimes matter. But for the time being, we're in, and I wish we didn't live in a world where aid was necessary. We're in this transitional period. Let's make the best use of each of these things. Let's be pragmatic and opportunistic. Squeeze as much out as we can of these moments and these opportunities while we try and create something better. To get that better thing, we need a lot more events like this and a more global informed citizenry. And please have a look at the film at 10 o'clock.
Thank you, Jamie, for being partly inside and partly outside, which is a very good positioning on this panel. And maybe I can just reflect for a moment on the question about what is different. I think it is true that it's important to try to get issues onto the agenda of the G8, that it can matter greatly, as we've heard. But I actually worry more about the fact that given the challenges that we're facing in the world today, I think we don't have the leadership that we need. We just don't have the sense of a real need to move forward. We have an opportunity. I just find it extraordinarily opportune that we have two huge agendas that have to be hopefully concluded by the end of 2015. One is the agenda that was touched on, the post-2015 agenda, And we have a good report now of the high-level panel on global partnerships. And I think if that report is not diluted and is taken forward, that will make a big difference. But it has to be balanced by the other agenda, which is the commitment to a new climate agreement by the end of 2015. And I'm sorry that Mark was quoting Ed Miliband as saying that this looks to be very difficult, because it's actually vital. If we don't get a climate agreement by the end of 2015, we don't know what the parameters of our world are to stay a safe world. And that's not just vital for the poorer parts of the world that are already suffering climate shocks, but vital in an intergenerational way. We're losing time to be able to influence and to be able to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius, which will still mean we'll have more and more climate shocks, but they'll be more or less manageable. If we go above that, then we're into uncharted waters that are terrible. And our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren will look back at this period and say, what on earth were they talking about? I think the fact that climate change is not top of a G8 agenda is quite extraordinary, because nothing else takes on the same sense of how we are to live in this world in the future. But that's my personal view. I'm delighted that this panel has, I think, performed very well in its task of trying to both advise and consider the challenges facing the G8 and the world generally. But I'm really delighted that this meeting itself is going to end with the voice of a poet, and a very distinguished poet at that I'm quite a fan of, Ben Okri. I'm going to invite Ben to come up to the podium. He's allowed to take the podium as well, which I didn't allow the panelists, apart from our distinguished speaker, Mark Moody-Stuart. Ben Okri, as you know, is a distinguished poet and novelist from Nigeria. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and has been awarded an OBE. He has numerous international prizes, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Africa, and his novel, The Famished Road, in 1991 won the Booker Prize. He has written a poem specially this evening, so I hope that, Ben, you will inspire us to think further on what the panel has provided us with. So I invite you to thank the panel for their contribution, in particular Mark Moody-Stuart for his speech, and then we'll hear Ben Okri. You frightened me for a minute. I couldn't see you, and you seemed, I thought you might have disappeared, left us, but no. Okay.
Thank you all very much. I thought that was a fascinating conversation from the panel. And I'm going to read a poem called Convergence, which in some way coincides with the headline there. And for very obvious but not very discernible reasons to everybody, it's dedicated to Michael Ominian because of his work with Zamin and being an umbrella for these set of events. The poem is called Convergence. Language on the faces, screams from the earth. All around, the globe is burning. Deep inside, we're all connected. The world is bleeding. The soul is reeling. There is a global fever, and money is crying, and only the poor shed its tears. Above the earth, sustenance is dwindling. The clouds glow with poison fumes. We think we're safe, but we're breathing in death, the death of dreams and all that it means. Oil spews ruining farmlands. Innocent shores receive the West's global waste. Forests of palm trees have become rivers of oil, and mountains of gold become craters of dead stone. Have you seen the mountain wastes of Tanzania, where they mine the earth and also fill it with fear? Have you gone deep into the bowels of Mozambique and been buried for less than the price of nothing unique? There's a weird logic in the world. The truly rich countries are poor, and some truly poor countries are rich. Where there should be harvests of laughter, there are just the shadows of hungry children in the streets. There is a red dust in the blue skies of Guinea. The bauxite, pulled from its earth like golden teeth, could sprinkle paradise from the red soil. But the earth is burned, and the mango trees lean out from the open mines. Many lands with their shacks and abundant rubbish heaps, their orange umbrellas in marketplaces, and gas combustion on the edge of forests have a fiery doorway to an ever-vanishing paradise. In Marikana, the ghosts of apartheid laughs in crooked vengeance. But dance with me along the timeline. The Silk Road and the spice trade route have thrown red bridges to little villages with tents in the desert. The history of the future will be the story of the transformation of the poor. From India to the Arctic, from London to Peking, from Nuremberg to Niger, there's a new language on the faces. Either justice or death, either collaboration or the fire of the gods, wrought by the unforgiving hunger of children. It's time to change the nature of the game. Time to write on the face of the earth the value and meaning of everyone's name. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben O'Cree. I think that was a very fitting way to end the Cultural Forum 2013, and let us all think about the issues that you've raised and the humanity that lies behind your words. Thank you very much. Thank you.